Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Thanks to everyone who's joined. Today, we're going to be talking about the 7 secrets to DevOps success. Those are basically secrets or principles that maybe are not intuitively obvious to someone without a lot of experience in the DevOps world, but are things that I've experienced personally over the years, in my sort of time consulting with various companies of various sizes and types, and lessons learned from observing high-performing DevOps teams and the things that they do differently that help them to be successful. After we go over the 7 secrets, those are kind of the guiding principles to high-performance DevOps teams. We'll also talk about some common misconceptions, some things that the high-performing teams get right on kind of a higher level, maybe not specific, secrets to their success, but the things they focus on a strategic rather than a tactical level that they get right that really helps them to succeed where maybe other teams have failed. Then we'll talk about some top mistakes just to cover the kind of common things that the top maybe 2 things that I see that teams do that cause them to fail, or the things that we go in and change if we're consulting with somebody to get them on the road to DevOps success. And then we'll look at, what does success actually look like? How do you define it? How do you measure it? And how do you know if you're actually successful in your DevOps initiatives? Because that is important, right? You have to justify the effort and the time that you spend on your DevOps initiatives to other business units, to the rest of the company, to management, those types of things. So you want to be able to have some metrics to back it up. But if you measure the wrong types of metrics, you can end up focusing on the wrong types of things, which is why I like to kind of wrap things up with, defining that success and how you measure it, and how to do so without making metrics the goal, but really making the success of the company as a whole and the holistic success of your team the goal, and how do you measure that successfully. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the 7 secrets. The first secret that teams that I see that are very successful in DevOps get right, and teams that fail in DevOps I often see get wrong, is teams that fail don't start small, and teams that are successful do. It's really tempting if you're coming in as a DevOps engineer, or if you're a manager coming into a new team or trying to implement a DevOps initiative. You want to have a big impact. You want to be able to demonstrate the impact of DevOps to the rest of the company. The problem is, if you don't start small, you end up creating so much disruptive change so fast that things start to break down. Usually there's every company has legacy processes. Even startups, they start to develop kind of legacy type processes and things like that hold the company back in some ways, but are also there for good reasons. And if you come in and try to radically change those processes, from a DevOps perspective, this would look like development processes, the tooling you're using, how your developers are getting code from their laptops to production, how your cloud infrastructure is provisioned, all those sorts of like DevOpsy type considerations. If you start changing all those at once, you're going to end up with very unhappy developers. You're probably going to end up with unhappy management because they're going to get complaints from people. And ultimately, you're going to be fighting kind of an uphill battle as you try to roll out your DevOps initiatives, because people aren't going to see the benefit. So I always try to scale back the scope of what teams are starting with when I'm talking to them about DevOps and how to get started and what to do. I try to scale back their sort of initial initiatives to small wins that they can demonstrate, in process, in tooling, in culture, in the way that they communicate. Let's focus on the fundamentals first, build that strong foundation with small wins before we try to make any big changes. If we can demonstrate improvement and sort of incremental improvement over the beginning of our DevOps transformation, then we get the buy-in that allows us to propose and make the bigger changes that we need. It's really important during this phase as well to solicit feedback. You're not going to get everything right on the first try. You're not going to be aware of all of the considerations necessarily that the other teams you're working with are thinking about. So it's really important that you solicit feedback from the other people that are impacted by this, even if they're not directly involved. Get as many people as you can involved, get their feedback, correct course as needed, and that will kind of help you build that really strong foundations that when you start to do things like making major tooling changes or changing process radically, you'll have that buy-in already, which will make everything a lot smoother. So this is actually probably the most important secret that we're going to talk about today, which is why I'm spending a bit of time reiterating this. It really is the thing that will make sure that your DevOps initiatives are successful. And it does differentiate teams that I see that are successful in their DevOps transformations versus ones that are not. So think about how you can break your big sort of goals and changes down into smaller bite-sized chunks. Start small and then build up momentum as you get buy-in amongst the rest of the company and the other teams. As you build up that momentum, then you have the buy-in where you can actually make some bigger changes and have a more radical impact. We covered this a little bit previously, but I wanted to reiterate this again. Have a system for getting feedback, particularly from people sort of in the trenches, the people that are in the everyday, dealing with the processes that are already in place, that are actually making the changes and doing the work. Particularly if you're a manager. If you're not in management, then you're probably in the trenches yourself, and you won't have a problem sort of talking to the people that are actually doing the work. But if you are in management, make sure you're getting feedback across teams, not just your own team, but teams across the company that are going to be impacted by the work you're doing. And you can do that by introducing actual processes. Think about how you can introduce a process or a mechanism for soliciting and then incorporating feedback from everyone. And this makes everyone more involved in the roadmap. So make sure you're sharing that roadmap as well as you're soliciting feedback, getting that buy-in across the organization from everyone that is involved. This is really key. This is another one that's super important, particularly as you're getting started. If people feel included and they feel like their feedback is heard and it's being acted on, this is really a principle that works anywhere in life, but it applies particularly in a DevOps context, where if people feel like they're being heard and they're part of the process, then they're much more invested in the success of the process. And thus they'll be a lot happier with the results of the process as well and feel like they had a part in that. So get that feedback, make sure you're getting it from the right people, the people in the trenches that really deal with things on the day-to-day. Be particularly sensitive to, complaints. People tend to be lavish with praise for these types of initiatives, and their complaints, when they do come, tend to be quite serious, I find. Sometimes they don't always word them or communicate them well, but if you're getting complaints from people, make sure you're thinking about what the pain they're really feeling, even if they're not communicating it effectively, and try to get to the root of it. Talk to them a bit more, really understand what they're dealing with and what their issues are, so that you can effectively address that as part of your plan for moving forward. All right, number 3, track and measure. So high performance DevOps teams that I work with, they track and measure almost everything. This can seem like a lot of overhead, particularly as you're getting started. But if you don't track and you don't measure what you're actually doing as you sort of create your DevOps transformation, you're not going to be able to justify it to the rest of the organization, the time and expense that you're spending on your DevOps initiatives. And if you don't measure them, you don't really know if you're moving in the right direction. It's really important that as you do this, you share the data across the organization. So this should not be something that just comes up in executive meetings or something that you have on a spreadsheet somewhere or something like that. Make sure that you're sharing this, whether it's via emails, via meetings, or just informally talking to people. Make sure people have access to this data somewhere. and that you're sharing it with everyone that's involved in the process. Don't be afraid to drop measurements if they are no longer useful, or you start measuring something and you find that it's not really correlated with any real world effects. Feel free to drop those, add new measurements as needed, as necessary. Make sure that you are measuring the right things. If you're measuring the wrong things, it's kind of meaningless anyway. It may have no real world impact. So figuring out what to track and what to measure is actually a process in itself, and you should try to apply the same sort of DevOps principles and agile principles to figuring out what you should be tracking and measuring as anything else. So don't get overly invested in the initial things that you think you should track, or things that you think you should measure, or the initial measurements that you start using. Don't be tied to those. Use them if they're effective. If they're not, drop them and add new measurements until you find a set of measurements that are effective, useful, and correlate with real world effects. That way, if you see one of those measurements changing in an unexpected way, or you're not hitting what you think you should be in terms of a measurement or something, it's actually meaningful and it's actionable. If you're measuring the wrong things, then it's not going to be actionable if you start seeing that metric either too high, too low, or you're seeing anomalies with it or something like that. If there's no actionable sort of real world way to correct that, then you're probably measuring the wrong things, and you should look at measuring something that's more effective. We covered this a little bit, but it really is a secret in itself, and it deserves its own its own bullet here. As you're thinking about your initiatives, the changes you're going to be making as part of your DevOps transformation, or just as part of your day-to-day DevOps process, make sure that everyone is involved. DevOps really does need to be a team effort across the organization. So make sure that you're not trying to make changes and push them out on people. Bring people and make them part of the changes. Communicate as much as you can. Over communicate, particularly to departments that might be unrelated to the ones that you're managing or that you're part of, and try to use as many different mediums of communication as you can. Again, mentioned earlier, email, meetings, those types of things. Some companies even go as far as having like an internal podcast that talks about kind of the things they're doing. That would be more relevant for like larger organizations. Startups, if you have like all hands meetings, things like that, make sure you're sharing your progress in those meetings. Over communicate and make everything as transparent and public as you can. Make sure that everyone is involved, aware of what's happening, and feels like they can give you feedback when they need to, and that they're a part of the transformation initiative that you're rolling out. This is another really critical one. Number 5 out of the 7 secrets. Make sure you're using the right tools. And this is sometimes used as a justification by managers to swap out the tools that are being used, particularly if they're new in a role or new to a team. They want to start using the tools they're familiar with. But don't mistake familiarity for the right fit for your organization, for your team. If you're rolling out a new tool, do a proof of concept first. Make sure that you test it against your real world requirements, and that it actually does what you need it to do, and that you're not breaking existing processes. It's really easy to change out tooling, particularly as you come in and start doing a DevOps transformation or trying to improve DevOps process. It's easy to blame the tools, or to think that you just need the new tools and it's going to fix everything. Sometimes that is the case. There's a really bad fit for a tool and you roll out a new one. It can be hugely transformative. Automation initiatives with tooling can be very transformative, but you have to make sure that you're really using the right set of tools, or you're actually going to slow yourself down more than anything. So do a POC, like I talked about, proof of concept. as you're rolling out a new tool. Make sure that it actually works for what you need. This is another excellent point where you can actually start looking at soliciting feedback on the tooling that you're using. So not just process feedback, but tooling feedback. Let some people actually try it out if they're invested in your process. Let them know what you're thinking. Give them a test playground to play with, or try to have the old tooling in place as you roll out new tooling so they can use both and see them side by side, and really listen to that feedback. This is a tricky balance because nobody likes change. So most organizations are kind of resistant to change, particularly in tooling. Process as well, but tooling is really a big one. People are familiar with the tools that they're using. So make sure that the feedback that you're getting is specific and actionable, and it's not just somebody that's scared of the sort of changes that you're making or isn't familiar with the tool and doesn't know how to use it. Having onboarding and training sessions as you roll these out can be really critical also, so people feel more comfortable and supported when they're using the new tool. And finally, when you're evaluating tools, simple is almost always better. Sometimes complexity is necessary. You have to have a certain level of complexity just to deal with certain processes or particularly technologies that could be rather complex, but try to abstract it down and make it as simple as possible without too many layers of abstraction between the tooling and what's actually happening. One tool that comes to mind that fits this kind of use case is Kubernetes. It's actually quite complex under the hood, and people complain about the complexity of Kubernetes a lot, but it's actually solving a very complex problem, which is the reason for its complexity. So, it's not necessarily that a complex tool is always terrible, or that it's the wrong tool, but you have to evaluate it in the context in which you're using it and make sure that the complexity is justified. If it is, great. Like in the case of Kubernetes, it's a solid tool. It solves a complex problem, orchestrating applications. And in the case of Kubernetes, I think the general consensus is that the complexity is justified because it performs a very complex role. There are a lot of cases though where things are overly complex, and you'll want to think about those and make sure that the tooling that you're using is complex enough to do the job, but not excessively complex where it's introducing overhead or it's excessive cognitive load on the people that are using it. That's a common reason why people will abandon tools or that hinders new tool adoption is when things are excessively complex and it's too difficult to learn and onboard and get involved with a new set of tools. The overhead is just too high for people, and they abandon it and they go back to the old ways, or they go to circumventing the tools, which is also something that you want to be careful of and make sure that people are actually comfortable using the tools that you have in place. Okay, moving on to feedback loops. This is number 6 in the 7 secrets to DevOps success. This is where you're really starting to use that the measurements and the data that you're collecting that we talked about previously, and the feedback that you have been soliciting. This is the part where you actually start to incorporate those measurements and the feedback that you're getting back into the processes. So try to identify what data is relevant to which processes, so which measurements you're taking or what feedback you're getting, which processes it's relevant to, and then have a regular review cycle for reviewing those processes and then incorporating whatever the data is telling you or whatever the feedback that you're getting is, incorporating those in. And where this gets really, really interesting is when you can actually automate that feedback. So if you have a data collection mechanism, either an automated metric of some kind, or even if it's manual feedback people are submitting, if you have that submitted and graded in some kind of automatic manner, then you can actually start to make that a metric that is fed back into some of your processes and automate the process of improving. So the process becomes a self-improving process at some point. Be cautious with this because that can become kind of a runaway thing in and of itself. So you want to have some sane parameters and some limits on your processes if you're automatically including data or feedback into them. But if you can do that successfully, it's really, really useful, and it gets you to a really good place. Obviously, you can't always do that. Some feedback is more nuanced, it's more human, and it can't necessarily be machine measured or automatically incorporated into a system, and that's fine. That's where you can have a manual review. Just make sure you're doing that on a regular basis. This is not something where you just set it up and it's done. It's something that should be a normal part of your everyday, looking at the data that you're receiving, the input that you're getting, the feedback that you're getting, and incorporating that into your process, into your automation, your tooling, and making sure basically that you're continuously improving. I almost called this secret continuous improvement, but I think that it's important to talk about the fundamentals of feedback loops and what they really are and how that drives continuous improvement. So it's more than just continuous improvement. You can think about continuous improvement all the time, but if you don't have the data and the feedback loops in place and you haven't isolated what data applies to which processes and which tooling, then you're never really going to improve in a continuous way. So feedback loops, super important. One of the fundamentals to taking what you've done as far as tooling, as far as measurement and feedback, and that's how it actually gets instantiated in the real world into this kind of self-improving loop that allows you to improve continuously. Finally, the last secret, and one of the more important ones, I think, is to stay flexible. As they say in, I think it was a famous general whose name I forget, who said, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." I always say, "No plan survives contact with the real world." As you start to roll things out, there are always things that are going to go wrong. There are things in real world process that you can never anticipate, particularly in larger companies where processes have evolved over time. There will be things that you come across that you just couldn't anticipate, you could not have possibly understood in advance, and that's where staying flexible is really key. Make sure that you are, again, incorporating sort of your learnings and the feedback that you get as you go along into your process, and make sure that your process is still relevant. Don't be afraid to drop something. Don't fall prey to sort of the sunk cost fallacy of like, okay, I've already invested in learning this new tool, or we've already changed this process, I don't want to change it again. Make sure you're going in with the mindset that we're going to try these things, we're going to try these changes. If they don't work, we just try something else. We roll back, kind of like a software deployment where you would deploy an application, and if you discover a bug or something's broken in the deployment or whatever, you could roll it back to previous version. Stay flexible with your process as well, and with tooling that you're using and all of those types of things, your communication methods. Try things. If it doesn't work, just fall back to the known sort of working process, and then try something else. It can be a little bit tricky to balance this because it can seem like you're just breaking everything all the time and nothing's really, working properly and those types of things. But if you find that balance, then you'll be able to kind of move forward, try different things without being too disruptive to existing process, and then take the best of what you learned from your different experiments and trying things, and then incorporate those into your more permanent process. So have kind of a way of trying different things without making them permanent immediately, and then figuring out what works, incorporating that. Finally, it's really important as you're doing this not to blame anyone for failed attempts. So you should be encouraging failure. Don't glorify failure. Failure is not something that you want to actually glorify or strive for, but it's also not something that you want to blame people for. If you start blaming people for failures, then they're scared to try things. You're ultimately not going to find sort of the unexpected processes or things that work for you that maybe you wouldn't expect right off the bat, because people are afraid to even try them. So no blame. Don't don't blame people for failing. Don't glorify it either. Find that balance where people are free to try things, but they're also free to say, you know what, this isn't working. We need to try something else. And you'll reach a good place where you're able to try new things without disrupting existing processes too much. And then you're able to roll back quickly to the tried and true when you need to. And that way you continuously improve your long-term outlook without severely disrupting the mechanics of how you work and how you do things in the short term. So that's the 7 secrets. I hope you find those useful. There's a Q&A feature on the webinar here, so feel free to ask questions there. I'll be covering that after the webinar. I'm going to now go through some more general strategic type things that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, just to kind of talk about how those relate to the 7 secrets and how you can use those in an overall strategic context. But this is a great time to start putting your questions in. If you have any, just use the Q&A box on Zoom here, and then I will review and go over those afterward, and we'll try to cover as many of those as we can. So moving on here to common misconceptions. I mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar. The most common ones that I see, I'm going to be kind of covering the top 2 on these sort of strategic things that I'm talking about here. The top 2 things that I see as we go along. So the first misconception that I see quite often is that you need to automate everything. I think it's really tempting to, particularly if you come from a technical or an engineering background, to come in and try to automate everything or focus on the tooling and the automation as the primary driver of DevOps success. And while those things are really important, process and people and culture are actually probably more important than the automation. They have to work together. So if you have just automation and tooling without process and culture, you're probably going to fail because your culture and your process for using the tools is not going to work well with them. And vice versa. If you have no automation, no tooling, but you have great culture and process, well, you're going to still be very slow and not particularly agile because your tooling is actually going to hinder you rather than helping you. So you need both to be working together. So I focused on the misconception that you need to automate everything because that's the one I see more often, is a focus on automation at the expense of the process and the culture. But it does go both ways. So just be aware, if you're in an engineering heavy organization, the focus is probably going to be on automation, which is fine. But make sure that you're also balancing that with process and culture. In the less common case where you're in a non-engineering heavy organization, then maybe you have an excessive focus on process and culture, and you'll need to bring in automation a little bit more heavily, but that's not one that I've seen as often. So just keep that in mind. The other misconception that I see a lot is that you need a DevOps engineer or a DevOps team in order to get started. Well, this could be very useful, particularly for technical organizations. It's not something that you absolutely need as a prerequisite to get started with DevOps. You can start to evaluate your process and your culture and your communication and start breaking down silos before you ever bring in an engineer or a team or a consultant or whatever it is that you're looking at. This is something you can do yourself, even if you're not technical. You will eventually need to start looking at tooling and automation, but it's not something that you have to start with. So this is, again, going back to the very first secret we talked about, starting small. Sometimes it's better to actually work on your process first, and then you'll be in a better place to bring in an engineer or a team to help you do the automation and the kind of technical side of things. Once you have a really good grip on kind of what your processes look like and you have a good internal communication culture and those types of things. This is particularly relevant for like maybe an IT team or an organization that's IT heavy, but in the more traditional IT sense where it's kind of sysadmin type IT stuff, and you're trying to move to a more agile DevOps type culture. Quite often you can kind of bring the existing people you have and help bring them up to speed on process and culture and communication and or even train them in some of the tooling that's needed to do some of the automation and the other more traditional DevOps type stuff, without even necessarily needing someone who's dedicated to that engineering or that team function. I do think in larger organizations, there is a place for a DevOps team, particularly for internal tooling and for helping to set standards that the other teams use and those kind of things. There is a place for the DevOps engineer role, of course, in an organization, although I'm not a huge fan of the DevOps engineer title per se. It is something that I think is useful because it's used so often these days. But just keep that in mind that you can get started without hiring somebody or bringing on a consultant or those kind of things. It is something you can kind of self-service as you go along. So keep that in mind as you're getting started. That kind of covers the top common misconceptions. Let me know in the comments if you have any other thoughts on that. I would love to hear those as well. Moving on to the top attributes that I see in high-performing teams. These ones are actually pretty simple. The ones that stand out the most is like the blameless culture, which I talked about a little bit earlier in more detail. Really just making sure that people are free to experiment and try things. And when things go wrong, nobody gets blamed. You look at the culture, you look at the process, and you look at improving it rather than blaming an individual for the failure. This doesn't mean you have no accountability. There's a difference between being accountable and blaming people, and that's super important as well. So, make sure that you do have accountability in place for people, that they're accountable for the output of their work and those types of things. But particularly when things go wrong, when there's a failure, things like that, focus on fixing the process, not the person, and blaming the process, not the person. This kind of ties into some aspects of like psychological safety and those types of things. There's a whole school of thought and whatnot in that area. But in the technical world, typically we just use kind of the term no blame. That tends to encapsulate kind of what we mean, particularly in the case of like a technical failure, like an outage of a service or something like that. And then the second attribute of high-performing teams that I see a lot that stood out to me is the focus on the process. So, rather than focusing on like getting bogged down in the day-to-day tactical stuff, high-performing teams always come back to the process, how they can improve the process, whether that's a tool that's involved with a process. It could be an automated process that a tool is doing, or a human process, or a communication process, like how we do meetings, or how we communicate different concepts and things like that. Whatever that looks like, what I see with high-performing teams that are doing DevOps is that they are focused on that process and they're making sure that they're always coming back to that. So, it doesn't mean you don't deal with the day-to-day as it comes up, or that tactical, sort of things that need to be addressed right away don't come up. It just means that, when you've dealt with that, at the end of the day, you come back and you think about, okay, how is our process doing here? How can we improve it? What can we do to make our process better? And moving on to top mistakes. Again, going back to the very first secret, start small. One of the top mistakes I see amongst teams that kind of fail, or maybe teams where I've come in and helped them implement DevOps after they've kind of had a failure in that area, is that they're trying to change too much too fast. So just reiterating, start small, try to take bite-sized pieces as you go along. Don't try to do everything at once, and make sure that you're completing one thing before you move on to the next. The second mistake I see a lot is that teams are not adaptable. They don't have feedback loops in place. They fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy, where they start working on something and then they're excessively invested in whatever they've done, and they're not open to changing it or accepting feedback on it, and making sure that they're able to actually act on the data that they're seeing, and or make changes or eliminate processes or tooling that's not working for them. So make sure you're adaptable, that you're soliciting and incorporating feedback, and that will help you to move faster and not get kind of bogged down in maybe your initial implementation. Quite often when we're initially scoping out a DevOps transformation, it's a rather naive scope, meaning that we don't have all the information we need to make the right decisions yet. So we have to move forward with the information we have and then adapt as we go along, and then incorporate those feedback loops to make sure that we're continuously improving. Okay, going on to measuring success. I think a lot of teams fall, so the first thing that I see that teams do that is maybe not optimal when measuring their success or their DevOps transformation is they measure against past benchmarks. So they say we're 10 minutes faster at doing this thing than we were last year. That's fine, but you need to make sure that you're also getting faster next month and the month after that and the month after that, or that you're improving along whatever metrics are important to you at a constant rate. This also goes back to doing things incrementally and starting small. I made that the first secret to DevOps success for a reason, because a lot of stuff kind of ties back into that. So make sure that you're measuring your rate of improvement, not just where you are currently as sort of a static place in time. So look at kind of, are we improving? Do we have the right feedback loops in place? Are we soliciting the right feedback? Is our data telling us what we need it to tell us? Meaning, like, are we measuring the right things? And do those have an impact on our real world process that we can actually act on? So make sure that you're focusing on that versus just static benchmarks of past sort of measurements and then measurements today. Obviously, you need to look at those, but make sure that you're also improving month over month, and that you're not just improved and then stuck in time. So I guess you could say focus on that continuous improvement. Make sure that you're actually measuring your rate of improvement versus kind of resting on your laurels once you've improved some things. And then the second thing is just focus on speed and the ability to get things done. So if you're wondering what to measure and how to measure it, quite often just measuring your speed and how fast you can do a real world thing that you need to get done. So look at your real world goals. Maybe that's deploying code to production, or maybe that's other things that are important to your team or to the company. But focus on those, and just how are you getting those done? Focus on the ability to get them done, and how do you measure the things that go into doing whatever it is that's important to your company, to make sure that you can do those as quickly as possible. All right, that is it for the 7 secrets today. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. I will just check the Q&A real quick here to see if we have any questions. Looks like we don't have any questions, so I'll give everyone just a moment here to ask any questions. If you have other questions you want to reach out privately, my email's here on the screen. You can also go to our website there and use the contact us form. We're always happy to chat with whoever is interested, and talk about your initiatives, what you're trying to do, and see what we can do for you. I'll just give us a couple more seconds here in case anyone has any questions they're typing in. Again, there's a Q&A. There's a Q&A box on Zoom here. If no one has any questions, then I will go ahead and end the webinar in a moment. Okay, so it looks like somebody does have a question here. So Division B, I'm not sure if that's a real name or not, but someone says, suppose I want to set up an entire DevOps initiative just by myself. What's the fastest way to get up and running? I'm going to just answer this one on air here. It looks like the name is Ray. So thanks, Ray, for that question. Really appreciate that. And so you're saying, basically, how do I get up and running just by myself? I guess this kind of depends on the size of your organization, and kind of how you think about what your initiative should look like. So if it's a startup and you're trying to get a DevOps initiative going, just for like a startup or something where you're one of the few people that is kind of working on it, then that's going to look a little bit different than if you're trying to set up a DevOps initiative inside a larger organization. If it's a startup, then you have a lot more control over kind of what is done and setting standards early on. In a larger organization, if you're just by yourself and you're trying to get up and running, there's actually an article I wrote. If you search for like subversive DevOps, there's an article I wrote on kind of how to do this a couple of years ago if you're trying to do it without management support, and you're kind of the the DevOps advocate within your organization, but you don't necessarily yet have the buy-in of management. The short answer for this is, whether this is a large organization or a startup, it's actually kind of similar. Focus on things that you can do that make people's lives easier. Show them the benefits of whatever you're doing and how it can help them and make their lives easier. Basically, show them by example, show them a better way, provide them better tools and better process to do things, and then that way they will be able to kind of see the benefits, and then you can move forward with things incrementally that way, rather than trying to tell them what to do. If you're a manager and you have the authority to tell people, hey, we're going to do things this way, that can be very tempting. If you're not, then it maybe doesn't matter as much. If you're an engineer and you don't necessarily have like management authority to make changes, then you have to kind of do things in a way where you're showing people a better method of doing things. If you're a manager, you can do the same though. Just make people's lives easier, provide them with the tools that they need to do things, and then go forward from there. So thanks for that question, Ray. I hope that answers the question. If not, feel free to, you can also type another one there, and we'll see if we can give you a better answer. All right, Justin had another question here. Tips on getting companies to sign up for DevOps. Okay, so this is another one where I need a little more context. Justin, maybe you can give me some context in the Q&A thing here by typing another question. Are you talking about getting companies to sign up, like if you're a consultant and you're trying to essentially consult for companies, or are you talking about like a company that you're working for? Okay, so it looks like you said consultant here. That's great. So tips on getting companies to sign up. I guess it depends on the relationship you have with them. If you, if you're essentially talking to companies that don't have any DevOps initiatives in place already, they don't know what it is and they don't know what they need, it's a little bit harder. And you may want to even frame it not necessarily as DevOps, right? Because the important thing is the benefits that they get, the ability to do things faster that are important to them, have better communication, less failures, better flow across the whole company. Those are the kind of benefits you can sell them without even mentioning DevOps. If it's a technical company, a software company in like Silicon Valley or something like that, they probably know what DevOps is. They probably know that they need it. But you want to sell the benefits of it, not just the technical parts of the implementation. So make sure they understand what they're getting out of it, how they're benefiting. Try to talk in terms of benefits to them. So frame it as the things that they're going to get out of it versus like the things you're going to do. Because people don't, if you're a consultant coming in trying to help a company, they don't really care about what you're going to do per se. They care that it's going to work for them and what they're going to get out of it in terms of benefits. So focus on that. Try to focus on their perspective, that kind of thing, so that they understand what they're getting out of it. And then, that way you're kind of communicating in a way that is clear to them that they understand. And they also will, be bought into kind of the result of the effort versus just the way that it's going to be done. And particularly as a consultant, that's important because people pay you for results, not for like your specialized technical knowledge necessarily. So I hope that answers your question. Looks like that's it for questions right now. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks everyone so much for your time today. Thanks for attending. Really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful to you. And again, if you have any other questions or you just want to chat, feel free to reach out, see Fornari at startopsgroup.com or via our contact at startopsgroup.com. And it looks like actually in the chat here, we have a follow-up question. New PC with nothing but Windows, Java, and Chrome installed to get DevOps up and running. The steps would be, yeah. So this is actually probably kind of a misconception of what DevOps is in some ways. So there's not really one tool set that you can install to get DevOps up and running. It's not just a single tool. If you're looking for tools that can help you with DevOps type things, a good place to start would be to look at like the principles of continuous integration with Jenkins, for example. That's one that you can run yourself locally. So I would, like, if I was trying to learn about this or play with, some different tools that could help me with my DevOps initiatives in the company, I would probably look at like Jenkins and Docker and start playing around with those locally. And then perhaps if you're using the cloud a lot, like AWS or Google Cloud or something like that, then you can also start to look at a tool called Terraform. I believe that the URL for that is terraform.io. But if you search for Terraform DevOps, you'll find the website for sure. It's a tool made by HashiCorp. So look at Jenkins. I'll type these here in case it's easier for you to actually Google them. Look at Jenkins, Docker, and Terraform as good places to get started if you are looking for kind of a simple DevOps stack. Yeah, Kubernetes. Kubernetes is also one that you can look into. I tend to save that one for later because it is a little bit more complex, and it's also not really something that you're going to be running locally on your machine. You can use something called Minikube. So if you want to run Kubernetes locally, look at Minikube, particularly if you're on Mac. There's another one called K3s that's interesting, kind of a pared down version of Kubernetes. So yeah, you can look at Kubernetes as well. That's one that's interesting, but definitely if you're looking at Kubernetes and want to run that, that's something that generally gets run in the cloud. It's a container orchestrator. As I mentioned earlier, it has a lot of complexity to it that you may not need in the early stages of DevOps. So think about whether you really need Kubernetes, if it's going to be the right tool for the job, for what you're doing. If you're in a microservice-y type environment, it's very useful. But think about that as you go along, and then think about the tool set that you need. Play with Jenkins, play with Docker, play with Terraform. Those are some really fundamental ones that we use a lot in the DevOps world, and then branch out from there. All right, we are getting low on time here, so I am going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Thanks so much for your great questions. It's been a pleasure chatting with you guys a little bit. And we will see you next month. Keep an eye out on the StartOps Group website. We are doing another webinar next month, similar to this one, on a different topic. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure you register on Eventbrite. for that one as well. I'd love to see you there also. Thanks again, everyone. We will see you next time.